Welcome back. Guess what I got in the mail this week? Can you see it? 2.8 millimeter, 9.5 millimeter diameter valve shim. And so we're going to get this put in. We'll get this bike put back together. Let me tell you, after a whole week, 5 days of driving the car in Los Angeles traffic, my commute is over 30 miles each way. I am really ready to get this bike back together and get back on it. But hey, I knew what I was getting into, and you know, some things in life you just have to accept. When I bought a motorcycle, I accepted that it needs maintenance at a regular schedule, and I needed to do this. And so, hey, it's that week of riding in the car that allows me to continue having many more weeks of not riding in the car because I'm taking care of this thing properly. So a little bit on why I went with a 2.8 millimeter instead of a 2.75. As you will recall from the previous video, when I was looking in the journal, I was right at the bottom of the spec on this particular exhaust valve, right at the bottom, you know, on acceptable, essentially. So that means I had a whole 1/10 of a millimeter step that I could have gone. So I could have gone from the 2.85 shim that was in there down to a 2.75. And you know, the logic there is that then that's that much longer that I would be able to go without doing a valve adjustment. And frankly, that's what I was looking to do when I went on eBay to look for my part, my shim, but I couldn't find one in that size. I did find one in a 2.8, so that's a half a step, and that is bringing me to halfway between the two, which is a really sweet spot to be. And I've got other valves that are right there at, I think one was at, you know, the 0.4 mark, so a little bit less than half. Based on the history, I've got 30,000 miles on this engine, so I've got a little bit of a pacing that I can understand from that. I'm likely to get another 15,000 miles, no problem, by taking just this half step. And so that's what I'm going to do. That's what I've got. I'll be fine, and this engine will be in just a really good place for the next 15,000 miles, at least as far as the valves are concerned. So let's get this thing in here. Not too big a job, obviously, at this point. We've got a cam out. We've got to put that back in. But first, let's put in the shim, put our bucket back down, and then I'll show you how what we have to do to measure and check this clearance now before we really button it up and get back on the road. Okay, so right here is where my shim is going to ride. And I just want to lubricate this a little bit. Hey, here's some handy oil. And put that shim into its little spot. Then the bucket goes down beneath it. This still has oil in it, but I'm just going to make sure that there's some oil on the surface that actually comes in contact with that shim. There we go. Slide that down. Now I've got the shim underneath the bucket and the bucket in. We can put our camshaft back down on here. But first, I'm going to put a little assembly lube right on top of those valves just to provide some initial lubrication when we first start it up. So just a little assembly lube. You know, I don't think it'd be the end of the world if you just used oil here instead, but I just like how sticky this stuff is, and I know that I'm getting good lube. And then I'm going to go ahead and take a little drip of this and just put it in these journals with a clean glove. And I'll do the same thing on the top cap. So here's the top cap that's going to go on there. And underneath are the tops of where the journals ride. I'm just going to put a little assembly lube on those too. I don't know if you can see at this angle. Tiniest little drop, doesn't take much. And again, I wouldn't be sweating it if I was just putting some engine oil in here. So just a little word on this cam before we put it in. On the gears on the end of this thing, there's actually two here, and they spring load and offset a little bit. So when I've taken this out of the head, out of the engine, the tension on those springs releases, and I don't know if you can see how those teeth are they're not aligned. And when we put this cam back in, we want to put these two cam lobes in the same position as the intake was, which is either that A or B position. Well, it's always going to be at top dead center, so depending upon which cylinder you're working on. On this one, it's number 1, so I'm in the A position, and we'll have those two lines on the end, right here and here, that have to go right flush with the top of the head. I'll show that as best I can. But when you torque this down, it'll shift slightly because of these springs in here. So you may have to take 2 stabs at torquing this down, but make sure you got it right, because once you've got it all buttoned up and you hit that starter button, you want to know you have it correct. So that's all I got on that. Let's put it in. Okay. So getting my lines lined up, my cam in the correct position. Make sure I've got these right. I just want to get my line of sight directly lined up. See, now that is off just slightly, and it should look off slightly when you first put it in, because when you torque it down, that's going to be it. When you torque it down, it's going to move just slightly because of those springs that I mentioned. There are dowels on this cap. The bolts go right through the dowels. Now I've got that backwards. How about that? You're kind enough to make it not fit backwards. Let me get these, my hands are really slippery right now. Let me get these bolts screwed in and get snugged down. I also need to get back into my owner's manual, which means I got to boot up my computer and get the torque spec. I forgot what it is for these bolts, and this is a very important torque spec. Don't go doing these by hand without a torque wrench. So now I've got my bolts snugged up to the point where they're contacting the cap, but I still have a gap here as I press this down on the journals, and I'm just going to go in opposing sides and slowly draw this down evenly. I can actually do it with just finger tension right now, but it's getting tight now where I need my ratchet. A little bit each way, and bring it down slow and even. Alternating. Don't be in a hurry and bring this cap down, at an angle or. Okay. So now I've got them all snugged down. They're just, snug, not torqued. And I'm going to double check that strobe. Here we go. double check my lines. They seem good. Yeah, they're in the exact same position as the top ones. They're not exactly flush, so I must not be exactly on the FT mark, but close enough. The point is, both the intake and the exhaust match. So now you would think that we could just torque that down, and that is the next step, and button this all up. But we don't want to do that. We want to go back and remeasure that gap. So first, let me get that torque spec, and we'll get to that point. Okay, so the correct torque for those, I guess it's called a journal cap, is 7 pound-feet or 10 Newton meters. And with my 3/8 inch torque wrench, this is my quarter, with my 3/8, 7 pound-feet is way down the lower end of what that thing's even capable of doing. And when you factor in that there's a little bit of, you know, plus and minus, give or take, on a wrench like that, I don't think the 3/8 is the right one to be using. It's better to be operating somewhere in the mid-range of a wrench's operational or usable range. So I've gone to my quarter inch, which measures in inch pounds or pound inches, and so I had to convert. 7 pound-feet is 84 inch pounds, so that's what I'm setting my wrench to. Not a lot of torque, so that's why you don't want to hand tighten, because most blokes will over tighten. And working in a crisscross, just a little at a time. Till I get the click. No hurry here. Do it evenly. Okay, this round I'll probably get it. There it is. Okay, I'm there. Okay, so now that we've got that journal cap on, we're going to go ahead, throw on the cover, and put this thing all back together and go ride it, right? Wrong-o, moose breath. We are going to go back in and check that clearance. You got to be sure. And we haven't still settled everything in here. Now it's time to rotate the crankshaft a full revolution and compress the oil. Remember, we rubbed a little oil on that Tappet shim and underneath the bucket? Want to get all that compressed out and recheck that clearance. So that's next. So another full counterclockwise spin on our crankshaft. I got one plug in now, so I buttoned up that back cylinder. Let me see. I got my FT lined up again. Okay, so I'm back in the A position on these cams. Time to get my feeler gauges out. Okay, we'll try our 0.203, and that fits. Try our 0.227, and that fits. We will try our 0.253, and that fits, but very snugly, so we're good. Okay, so once again I have my cover. Check that this O-ring around that dowel is there. Check that I have my gasket in good condition all the way around. I'm going to put some RTV silicone, the black Permatex, and then check that this O-ring or gasket around the spark plug hole is
is in a good place. And frankly, it'd be easy to put our spark plug in right now too, so I may just go ahead and do that. Again, just a little bit of anti-seize on the threads, not much. Doesn't take much. Brand new spark plug. Again, watch out for those gaskets on the back side of these bolts. Make sure they are all there. Without them, you won't get it tight. You'll have an oil leak. And I would guess a pretty profound one. And back to our torque wrench. And so you will recall from part 2 that the torque is 10 pound-feet. That's 15. There we go. So we're all done here. We can put this cover back on, and the timing viewing hole. Oh, left-handed, come on, there we go. A little bit of an aside, but I don't always get this view of the bike with everything stripped off. I'm looking at this and imagining the frame underneath all that plastic. You could make a pretty potent street fighter out of one of these DL1000s. Can you see it? I think I can. Hook up our breather again. Crazy. All right. I'm spending just a little bit of time, maybe 10 minutes, with my little screwdriver going up and down this radiator on both sides, although it's usually the front where you have the most damage because you get rocks there. And just straightening out these fins. I live in Southern California. We're going to see some temperatures that are over 100 degrees, and I'll be in rush hour traffic, going slow. I want to have the most efficient cooling machine I can. So this doesn't take too long, and I want to own this bike for a long time. Just a few minutes. In you go with the radiator. Nice and easy. I don't want to damage those fins. I just spent so much time cleaning up. Shroud gets hooked up a little bit here. There we go. And then it hangs on the other side of the frame with a peg. There, got that one in. And then this top bolt. Okay. I'll get my wrench and tighten that up. Top radiator hose can go back on. Get that slid on. Tighten the hose clamp. just need to be snug. They don't have to be really cranked down, these worm drive clamps. This fan switch connection routes over the top and down. And back up like that. When you get all this apart, it starts hanging way down here, so just remember it routes up and in, kind of in front of the radiator. We'll put our coolant reservoir back on. There's 2 screw holes in here. You want to be using the top and this peg in a bottom hole to hold it from tipping forward. And that's 10 millimeter. This you can do, either while you're screwing the reservoir on or before you snug it up, but this vent tube for the top of the reservoir has to come up through here. And then it connects at the top. Good time to reconnect, or they're already connected, we never disconnected them, but we popped them out of their holding holes in the back of the fan shroud, so we'll get all of these electrical connections snapped back into those holes. Pretty simple, I'll do off camera here. I need both hands. There's a hose coming out of the top of the radiator cap. Comes here, got this little elbow on it, so we go down the back side and up underneath here. Hard to do with one hand. Anyways, that's where that's going to hook up. Let me get 2 hands on this. Okay. Then I can hold it with the pliers. And as our cooling system needs more or less coolant, it's going to draw it from this reservoir. And then the final step is to get this bottom hose hooked up. And don't go all the way up to the radiator, just to where the elbow sits. Maybe some of the other models, SV and TL, they might be slightly different, I don't know. That's the wrong wrench. But tighten up this hose clamp. Good and snug, but not super tight. Oh, I got it unloosened. And now that our radiator is in and all hooked up, the final thing is just to get this bottom screw in place. And that is where our radiator shall live. Okay, time to top off our coolant. I'm going to check that I retightened the breather hole at the top of the water pump, and then just check that I tightened the drain plug. Sure I did, but am I sure? Yeah, that's tight. In part 1, I talked about reusing my old engine coolant and drained it into a drain pan where I could capture that. A dedicated drain pan. Once I got that out of that drain pan and into a clear jug that I could see, I looked in there and I saw some particles floating around, and it looked just a little darker than fresh, and I thought, I changed my mind. I'm putting fresh coolant in here. So now, when you mix your coolant, if you don't buy a premix, then and I don't, it tends to be cheaper if I don't buy the premix. I mix it 50-50 with, in my case, reverse osmosis water. Don't use like a charcoal filtered water. Really, your only 2 options are distilled water and I believe in RO water, because the minerals are all taken out of it in that reverse osmosis process. So I've been using RO water for years for coolant and have never had a problem. But it's distilled or RO, nothing else. Okay, so with the system topped off, radiator cap off, reservoir full to the full mark, which is on the other side. But I want to bleed the air out of the top of the boy, this is hard to do with one hand. Anyways, I'm going to loosen this until I get the air out of the top of the water pump and make sure that the water is all the way up to the top of the impeller. Let me see if I can, here, let me loosen it. Okay, so I got it loose, and now I'm just gonna, I don't know if you can hear that. There. And now I'm getting liquid out of it. So at first it kind of hissed with a little air coming out, and then once the hissing went away and I had water dripping out, then I re-snug it up. Now that I have the coolant filled up, topped off in the radiator cap is off, I need to get this thing off the paddock stand, which I did, and take off my side stand and get the air out of the top of the system. And I do that by leaning several times. I'm holding the brake, and then I got to do it the other way. I'll do this probably here. I'm tipping it so far it's actually pouring coolant out. But I'll probably do this, 2 times, 3 times a side. Just try to pull that out. Again, holding the front brake so I'm not moving forward. That's probably good. And the rest of it we'll let the engine do when I ride. You may find that the reservoir drops in level when you first ride this, so that's why you want to start out at your uppermost level, because it'll probably drain a little bit off, and then top that off later, maybe at the end of your first day's ride. And then finally put the tank on. Okay, I got the tank back on. I didn't show, but we got that final bolt on the front with the 2 10mm screws. You can see that in part 1. I'm going to stop this series of videos here because the next thing I'm doing is to do a throttle body sync before I button all of this up. It's been 10,000 or so miles since the last time I did it, and it's more convenient now than to take all the fairing and everything apart again. So I've already done a video on that process. Essentially it's about putting the tank back together and putting the fairing back on, and we've already done that in other videos. So that, in the 3 parts, is how to do a valve or tappet clearance check or inspection and adjustment. In this case we did just the one exhaust valve and everything else was in spec. So thanks for joining me. Hey, please be sure to like these videos if you enjoy them, and to subscribe so that you are updated on the latest videos that I'm coming out with. We're going to get back to the GS 550 Cafe Racer project very soon, and I've also got another video on the V-Strom that I've got in the works for some regular maintenance there on the drivetrain chain sprocket. Thanks.